There is a kind of question that cannot be answered with a demonstration. You cannot pick up a guitar and play the answer. You cannot step into a spotlight and perform it. The question George Harrison asked Jimi Hendrix one quiet evening in late 1966 was not that kind of question. It did not ask for proof. It did not issue a challenge. It did not carry the weight of skepticism or competition. It was something rarer than all of those things. It was a genuine question, asked by a man who had achieved everything the music world had to offer and who had discovered, somewhere in the middle of all that achievement, that he was still missing something he could not name. How do you hear music? 4 words. And yet, by most accounts that have filtered through the years from those who knew both men, what followed was a conversation that would quietly reshape the way one of the most celebrated musicians of the 20th century approached his art. Not loudly, not with proclamations or press releases, but in the slow, invisible way that genuine understanding changes a person. In the choices they make alone, in the sounds they reach for when nobody is watching, in the spaces they allow between the notes. This is the story of that conversation. But to understand why it mattered, you have to understand the 2 men who were having it, and the particular moment in history when they found themselves in the same room. London, in the final months of 1966, was a city that had started believing its own mythology. 2 years after the British invasion had turned American popular music upside down, and the English capital had come to see itself as the center of the musical universe. Carnaby Street, the Marquee Club, Abbey Road. These were not just addresses, they were monuments to a cultural transformation that had happened faster than anyone had expected, and that showed no signs of slowing down. George Harrison was 23 years old, and he had already lived several lifetimes inside the machinery of that transformation. By the autumn of 1966, the Beatles had stopped touring. They had retreated into the studio, and that decision, controversial at the time, incomprehensible to many fans, had liberated Harrison in ways he was only beginning to understand. For years, his role within the group had been clearly defined. He was the lead guitarist, the quiet one, as the Beatle who stood slightly to the side while John Lennon and Paul McCartney commanded the center. He played what the songs required, and he played it well, and he was famous beyond any reasonable comprehension of the word. But somewhere beneath the fame, beneath the carefully managed public image and the relentless schedule, something in Harrison was searching. He had discovered Indian classical music. He was studying the sitar under Ravi Shankar, submitting himself to the discipline of a tradition that valued years of dedicated practice over the kind of overnight celebrity he had achieved before he was old enough to vote. The raga tradition was teaching him something about patience, about the relationship between structure and freedom, about the way music could become a form of spiritual inquiry rather than mere entertainment. But it was also raising questions he did not yet have the language to answer, questions about perception, about what it meant to hear a sound not just as a sound, but as something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And then, into this particular moment of Harrison's searching, walked Jimi Hendrix. The story of how Jimi Hendrix arrived in London is one of the great origin myths of rock history. He had crossed the Atlantic in September 1966 at the invitation of Chas Chandler, the former bass player of the Animals, who had seen Hendrix performing in a small club in New York and immediately understood that he was witnessing something that had no precedent. Within weeks of landing in England, Hendrix was being discussed in hushed, almost reverent tones by musicians who had spent years cultivating their own reputations for innovation. He sat in on sessions. He attended performances. And everywhere he went, he left people slightly off balance, as if the ground beneath the assumptions they had built their careers upon had shifted a few degrees. He was 23 years old, the same age as Harrison, but he had traveled a radically different road to arrive at that age. Before London, before the experience, before any of the mythology that would eventually accumulate around his name, Hendrix had spent years on what was known as the Chitlin Circuit, the network of African American venues across the southeastern United States where black musicians could perform during the era of segregation. He had been a sideman for artists including Little Richard and the Isley Brothers. He had played hundreds of nights in rooms where nobody was paying close attention to the guitarist, where the music was background to dancing and the ordinary business of people trying to enjoy themselves. He had learned in those rooms to find music not as a performance, but as a presence, to let it arrive rather than forcing it, to trust the instrument in a way that went deeper than technique. By the time he reached London, all of that experience had compressed itself into something that was almost impossible to categorize. He was not a blues guitarist exactly, though the blues ran through everything he played. He was not a rock guitarist, though rock was the vocabulary he worked in. He was not a jazz musician, though he could hear and respond to harmonic complexity in ways that trained jazz players found astonishing. He was something that the existing categories had not prepared anyone to receive, and he was quiet. This is the detail that surprises people who encounter it for the first time. Off stage, away from the electricity and the spectacle, Jimi Hendrix was described by nearly everyone who knew him as a man of few words, deep observation, and an almost unsettling capacity for stillness. He listened, he absorbed, he noticed things that other people walked past without registering. George Harrison noticed this about him almost immediately. The exact circumstances of their first substantive conversation are not documented with the precision of a historical record. What is known, yet drawn from the accounts of people who moved in the same circles during those London months, is that Harrison and Hendrix occupied overlapping worlds during the period when Hendrix was establishing himself in the city. The musicians' community in London in the late 1960s was, despite its global fame, a surprisingly intimate network. People encountered each other at clubs, at parties, at informal gatherings in flats and rehearsal spaces. Reputations traveled fast in that world, and Hendrix's reputation had traveled faster than most. Harrison had heard the stories before he heard the music. He had heard that this American guitarist was doing things with a Fender Stratocaster that nobody had thought to do before, that he was finding tones inside the instrument that seemed to exist in a register beyond the purely physical. When he finally sat in the same room as Hendrix, what struck Harrison most, by his own later accounts, was not the playing. It was the listening. He watched Hendrix listen to music the way most people watch a skilled reader read, with a sense of witnessing an activity that looks simple from the outside but is actually the product of years of practice and a particular kind of dedicated attention. Hendrix did not tap his foot. He did not nod along in the practiced, slightly performative way that musicians sometimes adopt to signal their appreciation. He went still, and in that stillness there was a quality of reception that Harrison found both admirable and slightly baffling. It was as if Hendrix was receiving information through channels that Harrison was not sure he possessed. Hence the question, how do you hear music? But here is the thing about that question, and the reason it mattered. It was not asked by someone who doubted his own abilities. George Harrison was not an insecure man, and he was not a musician with reason to feel inadequate. He had written songs that would outlast most of what his generation produced. He had pushed the Beatles toward sonic experiments that expanded the vocabulary of popular music in ways that are still being understood. His instincts were extraordinary, and his ear was cultivated. But he had begun to suspect, somewhere in the middle of all that accomplishment, that there was a way of relating to sound that he had not yet discovered. The sitar studies were part of that suspicion. Ravi Shankar was teaching him that sound could be a form of devotion, is that the act of listening itself could be a spiritual practice. But the question had not yet resolved itself into something Harrison could hold and examine. It remained a feeling, a sense of something just outside the edge of his perception. Hendrix, when he answered, did not give a theoretical response. He was not a man who trafficked in music theory in any conventional sense. What he had was something different, a relationship with sound that operated below the level of conscious analysis, that arrived in the body before it arrived in the mind. He talked about hearing colors. This was not metaphor, or not entirely metaphor. He described the experience of sound as something that arrived in multiple registers simultaneously, that a particular note or chord or texture would carry with it a visual quality, a temperature, a spatial dimension. He talked about music as something you could be inside of, the way you could be inside a room, and how the room could change its dimensions depending on how the music moved. He talked about the spaces between notes as having their own kind of weight. Not silence exactly, but a presence, a held breath, something that communicated at a frequency that the notes themselves could not reach. He talked about listening as an act that required the whole body, not just the ears. He described a physical sensation he associated with music that was truly speaking, a vibration in the chest, a kind of opening that happened when sound connected with something deeper than aesthetic appreciation. He said that when he played, he was not always sure whether he was producing the music or receiving it, just that the guitar was sometimes more like a radio than an instrument, something that could pick up a signal that was already present in the air, if you could get out of your own way long enough to let it come through. And then he said something that Harrison would turn over in his mind for years afterward. He said that most musicians were playing what they knew, and that the most interesting music was what happened when you played past the edge of what you knew, into the territory where you did not recognize what was coming next. George Harrison was not a man who talked easily about the interior experiences of his creative life. His public persona, carefully maintained across decades of extraordinary fame, he was characterized by a kind of dry wit and a philosophical restraint that kept the deeper dimensions of his inner world at a respectful distance from the prying attention of the media and the public. He communicated through his music in ways that his interviews rarely matched. But there are fragments, in the accounts of close collaborators, in the occasional interview where the guard came down, in the qualities that music historians and producers have identified in his later work that suggest the conversation with Hendrix lodged itself somewhere permanent. The most significant of these fragments concerns the recording of All Things Must Pass, Harrison's sprawling, ambitious triple album from 1970, released just months after the Beatles dissolved. And it was a record that represented the first full statement of who Harrison was as an artist outside the group that had defined him. And it was a record of remarkable sonic complexity, layered, atmospheric, built from textures that accumulated and shifted in ways that seemed less like conventional rock production and more like something approaching the construction of a sound world. People who worked closely with Harrison during those sessions have noted that he came to the studio with a particular vision of what he wanted the music to feel like, not just how it should sound, but how it should be experienced by someone listening to it. He spoke about the relationship between the spaces in the music and the notes themselves. He was attentive, almost obsessive, about the way silence functioned in the arrangements, and he wanted the music to be something you could be inside of. These are not descriptions you would have heard from Harrison in 1964, or 1965, or even 1966. They reflect a shift in how he thought about the fundamental nature of what music was supposed to do, a shift that corresponds in time and in character with what people who knew him in those London years describe as the impact of his conversations with Hendrix. There is a particular quality that you can hear in the best of Harrison's solo work, a quality that sets it apart from the work of almost any of his contemporaries in rock music. It is difficult to name precisely, which is perhaps why it has not received as much analytical attention as some of the more overtly technical achievements of the artists around him. But it has to do with space, with the relationship between sound and silence, with the sense that the music is not filling a room but inhabiting it, that it is breathing, that it has dimensions beyond the purely sonic, that it reaches toward something that the notes themselves cannot quite contain. This quality did not come from Jimi Hendrix. It was Harrison's own, cultivated over years of practice and searching and the slow accumulation of understanding that constitutes a musical life. But there is reason to believe that a conversation in London in 1966, in which a quiet young man described what music felt like from the inside of his particular genius, helped Harrison understand what he was reaching for in a way that allowed him to reach more effectively. This is the kind of influence that almost never gets credited. It does not show up in liner notes. It does not generate a story that a publicist can package. It is simply the effect of one mind on another, working through the approximate medium of language, leaving traces in the work that accumulates over years and decades afterward. But the question that opened the conversation is worth returning to, because it contains something important about both men that is easy to miss in the glare of their separate mythologies. George Harrison asked that question because he was genuinely curious, not because he was looking to compete or to measure himself or to claim territory. He asked it because he wanted to understand something he did not yet understand. And this capacity for genuine curiosity, this willingness to ask a real question and wait for a real answer, was, in its own way, as rare as Hendrix's musicianship. Jimi Hendrix had been asked many things by many people in the brief, compressed years of his fame. He had been asked to prove himself, to justify himself, to explain himself to skeptics who felt what he was doing was noise rather than music. He had been challenged by musicians who felt threatened by his arrival. He had been celebrated in terms that reduced him to a spectacle: the wild man of rock, the guitar-burning showman, the psychedelic visionary, in ways that flattened the depth and seriousness of what he was actually attempting. He had rarely been asked, simply and directly, how he experienced what he did. Harrison's question, by that account, must have landed differently than most of what Hendrix was asked. It invited him not to perform or defend or demonstrate, but to articulate something he had perhaps never been asked to put into words before. And the articulation itself, the attempt to translate into language an experience that was fundamentally pre-linguistic, seems to have produced something valuable for Hendrix as well. Those who spent time with him in this period suggest he found these kinds of conversations genuinely nourishing, that he was a more thoughtful, more interior person than his public image suggested, and that he appreciated being engaged at that level. The two men, in other words, gave each other something in that conversation. Harrison gave Hendrix the experience of being asked a genuine question about the interior life of his musicianship. When Hendrix gave Harrison a description of a way of hearing that opened a door Harrison had been standing in front of without quite knowing how to turn the handle. What Hendrix described that evening, the synesthetic quality of his musical perception, the way sound arrived for him in multiple registers, the physical experience of music as a presence rather than merely a phenomenon, was not entirely unique to him. Various artists across musical history have described versions of what Hendrix articulated, but the way he described it, grounded not in clinical terminology but in the concrete, embodied language of someone reporting from direct experience, carried a specificity and a vividness that went beyond the general observation. He was not describing a theory of music. He was describing what music felt like from inside his particular nervous system. And in doing so, he was offering something that no music school, no theory textbook, no amount of careful practice could provide. A report from a place that most musicians could only approach from the outside. Harrison, by his own later indications and by the testimony of those who worked with him, took that report seriously. He did not try to replicate Hendrix's experience. That would have been both impossible and beside the point. But he used it as a compass, a way of orienting himself toward the territory that Hendrix had described. He began to ask himself, in the studio and in his private playing, not just whether what he was producing sounded right, but whether it felt right in the sense that Hendrix had described, whether it had weight, whether it breathed, whether it pointed toward something beyond itself. This shift in orientation is subtle. It does not announce itself, but it is audible, to ears attuned to it, in the accumulation of choices that characterize Harrison's solo work at its finest. Choices about what not to play as much as what to play, about the emotional temperature of a note, about the relationship between what is expressed and what is withheld. there is another dimension to this story that deserves attention, and it has to do with what both men were carrying in the autumn of 1966 beneath the extraordinary accomplishments and the growing fame. Harrison was beginning to feel the weight of a particular kind of loneliness that attends great collective success when the individual inside it starts to separate from the collective. The Beatles were one of the most celebrated groups in the history of popular music, and Harrison was a part of that. But he was also, increasingly, a musician whose own creative development was constrained by the dynamics of the group. Songs he wrote were sometimes set aside. Perspectives he was developing through his Indian music studies were not always welcomed in the group's creative conversations. He was famous in a way that paradoxically made him feel unseen. Hendrix, for his part, was at the beginning of a kind of fame that would accelerate to an almost inhuman pace over the next 4 years. He was building a reputation that would eventually outgrow every container anyone tried to put it in, and he was doing so as a Black American artist in a context that was not always equipped to receive him on his own terms. He carried the complexity of that position with the same quiet that characterized everything about him off stage. But it was there. 2 young men, both 23, both carrying more than their years should have required them to carry. Both searching for something that the fame and the achievement and the admiration of the world had not been able to provide. One of them asked a question. The other answered it. And somewhere in the space between the question and the answer, something passed between them that was more valuable than either could fully account for in the moment. The years that followed moved very differently for both of them. Harrison continued with the Beatles through the recordings that would define the final era of the group, a period of extraordinary collective creativity that also became, for him personally, a period of intensifying creative constraint. When the group finally dissolved in 1970, the music he released in the months afterward suggested the release of a pressure that had been building for years. All Things Must Pass was a statement of a musician who had finally been given the room to become fully himself. The sonic architecture of that record, its layering, its use of space, its refusal to fill silence with unnecessary sound, carried the fingerprints of years of private searching, and at some remove, the influence of a conversation about colors and textures and the rooms that music could build inside a listener's mind. Hendrix moved with extraordinary speed through the next 4 years. There is a quality to his work in this period that has led many who have studied it carefully to describe him as someone who was trying to get somewhere, musically speaking, that he could sense but had not yet arrived at. Someone whose greatest work might still have been ahead of him when his life ended in September 1970 at the age of 27. Harrison was 27 when Hendrix died. By several accounts, the loss affected him deeply, not just as the loss of a musician he admired, but as the loss of someone who had offered him a way of thinking about music that had become part of the fabric of his own practice. In a world that rarely paused long enough to ask the right questions, Hendrix had been one of the few people Harrison had found who seemed to understand, from the inside, what music was actually for. When people write about George Harrison's legacy, they tend to focus on the songs, the sustained guitar note that opens Something, the delicate accumulation of sound in Here Comes the Sun, the slide guitar that runs through decades of solo work like a thread connecting different versions of the same inquiry. And the songs deserve that attention. They are remarkable works, and they have earned their place in the permanent record of what popular music can accomplish when it aspires to something beyond the merely commercial. But there is a quality underneath the songs that is harder to write about, because it is not the kind of thing that shows up in a chord chart or a production credit. It is a quality of attention, of presence, of a particular way of inhabiting sound that communicates something to the listener without ever making that communication explicit. This quality did not come from a single conversation. It was the product of decades of practice, of Ravi Shankar's teaching, of the particular kind of spiritual searching that Harrison pursued throughout his adult life. But a conversation in London in 1966, in which a quiet young man from Seattle described what music felt like from the inside, was part of what pointed Harrison in the direction he would spend the rest of his life traveling. There is a way that certain conversations echo, not in what gets remembered or written down, but in the texture of the work that comes after them, in the choices that seem to be made from a slightly different place than before, and in the sounds that appear in the music that nobody can fully account for in terms of technique or theory, or the ordinary explanations of how artists develop. Listen to the guitar on Isn't It a Pity? Listen to the way it moves in the arrangement, not dominating, not filling every available space, but placing itself with a precision that is also a kind of patience. Listen to the way it breathes. Listen to the slide work that runs through the later albums, the way it seems to be speaking rather than simply playing, reaching for something beyond melody, using the instrument to say things that words and conventional harmony cannot contain. Listen to the spaces. In those spaces, in the relationship between what is played and what is left unplayed, between the note and the silence that follows it, there is something that connects back, and in ways that can be felt more than explained, to a conversation in London in 1966. One young man describing what music felt like from the inside, the other listening and understanding in the particular way that musicians understand things, not just with the mind, but with the body, not just in the moment, but in the long accumulation of work that follows. George Harrison asked Jimi Hendrix how he heard music. Hendrix answered as honestly as he could in the approximate language of a man trying to describe something that exceeded language's capacity to contain it. And in the years that followed, Harrison carried that answer into the studio, into the silence before the first note of a song, into the choices that nobody sees being made but that everybody, in some form, can hear. Sometimes the most important conversations in a musical life are the ones that happen quietly, in ordinary rooms, between people who are not yet trying to make history, but are simply trying to understand something true. Sometimes the question is the teaching, and sometimes the answer lives not in what gets said, but in what comes after, in the music that finds its way, years later, into the space that the question opened.